Sometimes letting go is the hardest thing we can do, but it's also the key to unlocking a future full of endless possibilities. Discover the power of releasing the past and embracing the strength within you. Jenna had always believed that perseverance was the key to everything. She grew up with the idea that if she worked hard enough and stuck with things long enough, eventually things would turn around. She watched her parents struggle through their own challenges, yet they never gave up. She admired their resilience and absorbed their tenacity as her own guiding principle. But there was something Jenna hadn't yet learned: the importance of knowing when to let go. It wasn't that she didn't face obstacles. On the contrary, Jenna had seen plenty of hardship in her life. From her parents' financial struggles to the emotional scars of a series of failed relationships, she had witnessed her fair share of challenges. But even when things became unbearable, Jenna's instinct was to hold on tighter, to try harder, to push further. She didn't know how to quit. And in her mind, quitting meant failure. Jenna's latest struggle was the hardest one yet. She was in a relationship with Mark, a man she believed was her soulmate. At first, everything seemed perfect. They connected on a deep level, shared similar values, and had an easy rhythm between them. It felt like a dream come true, and for a while it was. But soon, small cracks began to form. Little disagreements turned into bigger arguments. Trust began to erode, and the joyful moments she once cherished now seemed overshadowed by tension. Despite everything, Jenna couldn't bring herself to leave. She couldn't admit that the person she loved so deeply had changed into someone who made her feel insignificant, disrespected, and even fearful at times. There were good days, yes, but the bad days were starting to outnumber them. Jenna would rationalize the situation, telling herself that relationships were hard, that no relationship was perfect, and that it was her responsibility to work through the problems. She was determined to make it work, no matter the cost. But as time went on, Jenna realized that the cost was much higher than she had anticipated. It wasn't just her energy and patience being drained, it was her sense of self. One afternoon, while sitting in a cafe, Jenna found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. Her friends had been telling her for months that she needed to let go. They told her that no one should have to endure this much pain in a relationship. But Jenna couldn't see it that way. She believed that if she just kept trying, if she just stayed committed, things would get better. Mark had so much potential, and she loved him too much to give up on him. But as she looked out at the busy streets, Jenna couldn't help but wonder. If other people were able to move on from relationships that weren't serving them, why couldn't she? It seemed like everyone around her was able to find happiness, even after hardship. Why did she feel stuck? Why did it feel so hard to let go, even when deep down she knew it was the right thing to do? The weight of her emotions was beginning to feel unbearable. Jenna felt exhausted. She had spent so much of her life focusing on the needs of others, trying to fix things, trying to make everyone happy, trying to be the glue that held everything together. But what about her own happiness? What about her own well-being? She had been so focused on making the relationship work, on making Mark happy, that she had neglected her own needs. Her soul felt empty, and the life she had once dreamed of seemed increasingly out of reach. She began to wonder if she had been holding on to the relationship because she feared being alone, or because she didn't want to admit that she had been wrong about Mark. The truth was, Jenna was afraid. She was afraid of what it would mean to let go. She was afraid of the unknown, afraid of facing the future without the comfort of a relationship, even if that relationship was unhealthy. The fear of being alone, of starting over, consumed her. But as Jenna sat in that cafe, she began to realize something she hadn't fully understood before. Sometimes, letting go isn't about admitting failure. It's about choosing to save yourself. Letting go wasn't something that came naturally to Jenna. She had always been the one to hold on, to fight for what she believed in, no matter how much it cost her. She had always believed that love was worth fighting for, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. But now, sitting there in that cafe, Jenna began to understand that there were some battles that weren't worth fighting. Some relationships weren't meant to be saved. Some people weren't meant to stay in her life forever. And by holding on so tightly to something that was hurting her, She was only preventing herself from experiencing the life she truly deserved. But even as this realization settled in, Jenna still struggled with the idea of letting go. The fear of change, of uncertainty, lingered in her mind. She loved Mark, and letting go felt like a betrayal. How could she walk away from something that had once been so beautiful? How could she turn her back on someone she had invested so much love in? The emotional attachments were strong, and every fiber of her being told her that she couldn't walk away. But deep down, she knew she had to. Jenna's mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. One moment, she was certain that letting go was the right thing to do. The next moment, she was filled with doubt. She didn't know how to take the first step. She didn't know how to say goodbye to someone she had once believed she would spend forever with. But she knew that the longer she stayed, the more she would lose herself. And that realization was the catalyst she needed. In that quiet moment, Jenna made a decision. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but she knew it was time to let go. She was ready to stop fighting for a relationship that was no longer healthy, to stop holding on to something that was no longer serving her. Jenna didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. It would be better than staying in the suffocating grip of a relationship that had drained her. Letting go would not be a failure. It would be the first step toward her freedom. And with that thought, Jenna took a deep breath, ready to face the journey ahead. The road would be long, but she was finally ready to embrace it. It was time to let go and let herself heal. Jenna woke up early the next morning, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds. It was a new day, but the weight of the decision she had made the night before still lingered on her heart. The emotions that had been building up for months, the frustration, the pain, the exhaustion, now seemed like a distant echo in the quiet morning. Despite the clarity she had felt the night before, the reality of her decision was beginning to set in, and Jenna couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and uncertainty. Could she really go through with it? Could she really walk away from the person who had once been everything to her? As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, Jenna reflected on the journey that had led her to this point. She had been in relationships before, but none had affected her the way this one had. Mark had been different. He had swept her off her feet, made her feel special in ways no one else had. But as the months passed, the charm of their early days faded, and the relationship began to unravel. Jenna found herself questioning her own decisions, wondering if she had missed warning signs along the way. She had tried so hard to make things work, but the cracks had only grown deeper, and now it felt as though there was no turning back. But what scared Jenna the most wasn't the relationship itself. It was the fear of being alone. She had always been someone who sought connection, who thrived in the company of others. The thought of walking away from Mark meant stepping into an unknown future, one where she would have to face herself without the comfort of another person by her side. The loneliness that had once seemed like a distant concern now loomed large in her mind, and it was hard to ignore. Jenna knew that she couldn't keep living in this emotional limbo, but it was so difficult to break free. Every time she thought she had gathered enough strength to make the call or have the conversation, doubts would creep in. What if things could change? What if she was overreacting? What if she made a mistake that she would regret forever? It wasn't easy to let go of something she had invested so much into, and it felt like the right decision was always just out of reach. But deep down, Jenna knew that the longer she stayed in the relationship, the more she was losing herself. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her fear of being alone wasn't just about being single. It was about facing the truth, that the life she had imagined for herself wasn't aligned with the life she was living. She had been holding on to the hope that things could get better, but she had ignored the signs that the relationship was no longer healthy. Jenna had placed all her hopes on someone else, believing that love would fix everything. But now she saw that true healing had to come from within. She needed to stop depending on someone else for her happiness and start creating it for herself. Over the next few days, Jenna took the time to reflect on everything that had led her to this point. She began to make small changes in her routine, things that would give her a sense of independence and control. She started journaling again, a practice she had abandoned for months. Writing her thoughts down helped her process the emotions that were swirling inside her. She wrote about her hopes, her dreams, and most importantly, the things she had been avoiding: the fear of being alone, the guilt of leaving someone she still loved, and the overwhelming sadness of the relationship coming to an end. But as Jenna wrote, something shifted. She began to realize that she wasn't losing herself by letting go of Mark. She was gaining herself back. She had given so much of herself to the relationship, and in doing so, she had forgotten who she truly was. Now, she had the chance to rediscover the parts of herself that had been buried beneath the weight of the relationship. She could focus on her own growth, her own healing, and her own happiness. Letting go didn't mean she had failed. It meant she was taking control of her own destiny. It meant that she was giving herself permission to be free. The next time she saw Mark, Jenna was nervous but determined. She had spent days mentally preparing for this conversation, but she still wasn't sure how it would go. She had rehearsed her words, trying to find the right balance between honesty and kindness. When they sat down to talk, the words seemed to spill out of her before she could stop them. She told him how she had been feeling for months, how she couldn't ignore the emotional toll the relationship was taking on her. She explained that, as much as she cared for him, she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Mark's reaction was a mixture of surprise and sadness, but Jenna could see the resignation in his eyes. He had known, on some level, that things weren't right between them. They had both been holding on to something that wasn't working, but neither of them had been ready to admit it. As Jenna spoke, she could see the walls he had built around himself start to crack. He, too, had been afraid of letting go, afraid of facing the truth that their relationship had run its course. But in that moment, they both realized that it was time. The conversation wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. There were tears and silence, and there were moments when Jenna doubted her decision. But when it was over, when they finally said their goodbyes, Jenna felt an unexpected sense of relief. It wasn't because she was glad to walk away from Mark. She still loved him in many ways, but because she knew she had done the right thing. She had made a choice to prioritize her own well-being, to take responsibility for her own happiness. Over the following weeks, Jenna experienced a range of emotions. There were moments of doubt, moments when she missed the comfort of the relationship and wondered if she had made a mistake. But with each passing day, she began to feel more at peace with her decision. She threw herself into new hobbies, reconnected with friends she had neglected, and started focusing on her career. Slowly but surely, Jenna began to heal. It wasn't an easy process. There were times when she felt overwhelmed by the weight of her past, when the fear of being alone crept back in. But each time those fears resurfaced, Jenna reminded herself that letting go wasn't a failure. It was an act of strength. It was the first step toward building the life she truly wanted, a life that was defined by her own choices, not by the limitations of a relationship that no longer served her. As Jenna moved forward, she realized that letting go wasn't just about relationships. It was a lesson that applied to all aspects of her life. Letting go of the things that held her back, whether they were toxic relationships, limiting beliefs, or unhealthy habits, was the key to unlocking her true potential. She wasn't defined by her past, and she didn't have to stay stuck in a life that no longer made her happy. The future was full of endless possibilities, and Jenna was finally ready to embrace them. Letting go wasn't easy, but it had opened the door to a life of freedom, peace, and self-discovery. And that was worth everything. As the weeks passed, Jenna began to feel the weight of her decision gradually lift from her shoulders. It wasn't as though everything instantly fell into place, nor did the pain vanish overnight, but she started to recognize a new sense of freedom she hadn't known in a long time. The initial days after her conversation with Mark had been the hardest. She had experienced the familiar ache of loneliness and doubt, and sometimes she would question if she had made the right choice. But as time went on, Jenna started to realize that letting go had opened up new possibilities she had never considered before. She took long walks through the park, sometimes with a friend, other times alone, just allowing herself to breathe in the fresh air. During these moments, Jenna noticed something she hadn't paid attention to in years. The world was still turning, and she was still part of it. In her relationship with Mark, She had become so focused on the relationship itself, on what was missing and what was wrong, that she had lost sight of the simple joys of life. Now, she could see things differently. She found herself enjoying the beauty of a sunrise, the warmth of a cup of coffee, the laughter of a good conversation. For the first time in a while, Jenna could appreciate the quiet moments of peace that had once been overshadowed by emotional turmoil. Her friends noticed the change in her too. It was subtle at first, but they could see that Jenna was beginning to blossom again. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was engaged in her own life, pursuing things she had always wanted to try, but never had the time for. Jenna joined a painting class, something she had always been curious about, but had never taken the plunge to do. She spent more time reading, getting lost in books that inspired and challenged her. She started making plans for the future, setting goals that didn't involve someone else's approval or validation. For the first time in years, Jenna was living for herself. As she began to find joy in the little things again, Jenna also realized that letting go didn't mean she was abandoning the good memories she had with Mark. It didn't mean she was erasing their past or pretending that their love hadn't been real. What she had with Mark had been beautiful at one time, and she would always cherish those moments. But it was also okay to recognize when a chapter of your life had ended and that it was time to move on. Holding on to something that was no longer healthy or fulfilling wouldn't bring back the good moments. It would only keep her stuck in a cycle of hope for something that no longer existed. Jenna's journey of self-discovery wasn't just about learning to let go of the relationship. It was about learning to let go of the limiting beliefs she had carried for so long. For years, she had believed that she needed to be in a relationship to feel whole. She had tied her self-worth to her ability to keep a relationship together, convinced that the love and approval of another person was the key to her happiness. But now, as she stood on her own 2 feet, Jenna realized that her worth wasn't defined by her relationship status or by anyone else's perception of her. She was worthy of love, peace, and happiness simply because she was herself. It was an empowering realization, but it didn't come easily. There were days when she still struggled with self-doubt, when the voice in her head would tell her that she wasn't enough or that she wasn't deserving of the life she was now building. But Jenna had learned something crucial during her time of reflection. She didn't need to listen to those voices. They were the remnants of past fears and insecurities, the things she had been told or had told herself for years. Letting go of Mark was just the first step toward letting go of those negative beliefs. She didn't have to carry them with her anymore. One afternoon, while sitting by herself, in the cafe she had frequented during her relationship with Mark, Jenna realized something profound. She had returned to this place many times over the past few weeks, and each time, it felt different. At first, it had been hard to sit there without the familiar presence of Mark, without the shared conversations and quiet moments. But now, as Jenna sipped her coffee and observed the people around her, she felt a sense of peace. She was no longer clinging to what was gone. She was fully present in her own life, enjoying the moment for what it was. She had come full circle. The cafe, once a place that symbolized her pain and the uncertainty of her future, had become a symbol of her strength and her newfound freedom. Jenna had learned that letting go wasn't just about walking away from people. It was about walking away from the emotional baggage that weighed her down. It was about letting go of the past, of old habits, and of fears that held her back. Letting go didn't mean she was giving up. It meant she was giving herself the chance to grow. And that growth, Jenna realized, was the true gift that came from her decision. Over time, Jenna's relationships with others began to evolve as well. Her friends noticed that she was more present, more engaged, and more confident in herself. She was no longer the woman who clung to others for validation. She had learned to validate herself. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet and embrace her worth without relying on external sources. Jenna began to attract new people into her life. People who valued her for who she was, not for what she could give them. And in this new space, Jenna could be herself fully, without fear or hesitation. As the months went by, Jenna continued to grow and evolve. Her life was no longer defined by the relationship she had left behind. It was defined by the woman she was becoming. She was stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than she had ever been. And through it all, Jenna learned that the most important relationship she would ever have was the one with herself. When she finally made peace with her past, she discovered that she was capable of so much more than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just letting go of a relationship, she was letting go of the limitations she had placed on herself. And in doing so, she had unlocked a future full of endless possibilities. Jenna smiled as she looked out the window, feeling the warm rays of the sun on her face. She had come so far, and she was finally ready to embrace the future with open arms. Letting go had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but it had also been the most transformative. And as Jenna moved forward, she knew that the best was yet to come.